Someone commented on one of our previous videos that every country had slavers and buyers of slaves throughout history. This is true, and when we think of slavery, it's the slave that is owned, the slave that is just property, property with no rights. This hasn't always been the case, and for the vast majority of us, we have been enslaved and are slaves, according to previous definitions of the term. I digress, and we'll get back to that part later when all of you can see it for yourselves. In ancient history, countries weaker than another or who had lost in wars were often given an option to pay interest on a loan with their own lives, their land's families, crops being the collateral if they did not. The citizens or the elite of the country that was more powerful did not pay such a tax or tribute, just the lower classes or the losers. The enslaved losers paid to the rich victors. They, the slaves, still had rights and dreams, just not the same opportunities or freedoms as the rich. Today, we call this tribute, taxes or interest paid on state and federal loans and/or bonds. There are some famous examples of this kind of slavery from ancient history. In Genesis 47:13-26, Joseph, who had become the governor of Egypt, made the Egyptians sell their land, livestock, and themselves to Pharaoh in exchange for grain during a severe famine. He also imposed a 20% tax on the produce of the lands they lived on. This debt could never be paid off. The Egyptian citizens did not pay the taxes. The taxes instead went to the rich. He did the same to his brothers. Though the Israelis could now live instead of starve, they and their descendants were now slaves for the next few hundred years, in that they had to pay 20% annually on their debt, which, if you think about it, is a whole lot less taxes than we pay today. When God, through Moses, liberated the 12 tribes of Israel, a system of justice was established by God, so this form of slavery couldn't happen again to any of his followers. The rich were not to rule over the poor. The tithes went to the poor, and the fellow Israelis were to bring their brothers out of poverty. Exodus 22:25, 26:25. If you lend money to one of my people among you who is needy, do not treat it like a business deal. Charge no interest. 26. If you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, return it by sunset. And a 7-year cycle was established, where if a person had not paid back his debt, it was forgiven at the end of it, even if the loan had just been given at the end of the 7-year period. It gets even better. The taxes, tithes, were paid every 3 years, and this tithe was 10% of a person's increase. So if a person started with 100 cattle and 3 years later had 110 cattle, then his tithe was 1 cow. And that person decided what widow, orphan, or newcomer struggling family to give it to. A person who was struggling, that had to take an interest-free loan, did not pay the tithe. They did not have an increase if a loan was needed. They were given the tithe. In fact, on the 7th year, when the loans are forgiven, meaning the slaves were free. Now, if you worked for another business, meaning you didn't have one of your own, then you were a wage slave. On this 7th year, God said to do this. When you send a former employees away, do not let them go empty-handed. Deuteronomy 15:13. So, the former employer of the wage debt slave, even if it wasn't a usury loan, interest-charging loan, and the employer wasn't paid all the way back, the employer would give freely to their former laborers, or what we would call apprentices, were given of the employer's flocks, tools, and the community would usually help build their home and business building debt-free. Modern-day debt slavers would call this socialism. God called it love. Leviticus 19:18. You shall not seek vengeance, and you shall not harbor a grudge against your fellow citizens, and you shall love your neighbor like yourself. Some other examples of countries and societies that practiced or still practice this type of debt and tax slavery is as follows. In ancient Egypt, peasants who could not pay their taxes were forced to work as corvée laborers on public projects such as pyramids, temples, and canals. In colonial America, some of the founding fathers who opposed taxation by Britain also enslaved Africans and imposed a 20% tax on the produce of their land. In modern times, some critics of income tax argue that it violates the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery and involuntary servitude by compelling people to work for the government without their consent. In some parts of the world, debt slavery still exists, where people are trapped in a cycle of borrowing and repaying money to landowners or moneylenders, often with high interest rates and harsh conditions. In the Peloponnesian War, 431–404 BC, Athens imposed a tribute on its allies in the Delian League, which was a coalition of Greek city-states against the Persian Empire. The tribute was used to fund the Athenian navy and the construction of the Parthenon. Some of the allies rebelled against the tribute, which led to conflicts with Athens. In the Punic Wars, 264–146 BC, Rome fought against Carthage for the control of the Mediterranean. After the First War, Rome forced Carthage to pay a large indemnity and cede some of its territories. After the Second War, Rome imposed an even larger indemnity and restricted Carthage's military and naval power. After the Third War, Rome completely destroyed Carthage and enslaved its population in a own-the-person-as-property way. In the Gallic Wars, 58–50 BC, Julius Caesar conquered Gaul, modern France, and made it a province of the Roman Republic. He imposed a heavy annual tribute on the Gallic tribes and also took many of them as hostages or slaves. He also used the wealth and manpower of Gaul to fund his civil war against Pompey. In India, the British colonial rule imposed a system of land revenue collection that forced many peasants into debt and bondage. The British also extracted a heavy tax from the Indian textile industry, which led to its decline and impoverishment. In China, the Qing dynasty used a system of corvée labor called baojia, which required every household to provide one male member for public works or military service. The Qing also imposed a head tax on the ethnic minorities in the border regions, which often resulted in their enslavement or displacement. In Japan, the Tokugawa shogunate established a feudal system that divided the society into 4 classes: samurai, peasants, artisans, and merchants. The peasants were bound to their land and had to pay a fixed amount of rice as tax to their lords. The merchants were also subject to various taxes and regulations that limited their mobility and wealth. In Turkey, the Ottoman Empire practiced a form of slavery called devshirme, which involved the abduction of Christian boys from the Balkans and Anatolia. They were converted to Islam and trained as soldiers, administrators, or janissaries. The Ottoman Empire also levied a poll tax on non-Muslims called jizya, which could be avoided by converting to Islam or becoming a slave. In Russia, the Tsarist regime used a system of serfdom that tied the peasants to their land and masters. The serfs had to pay a fixed amount of labor or produce as rent to their landlords. They also had to serve in the army or work in the mines or factories when required by the state. The serfs had no legal rights and were subject to the arbitrary authority of their masters. Vikings didn't just raid the Slavs, but raided and enslaved many Irish people from the 9th to the 11th century. Normans, who invaded and colonized Ireland in the 12th century and imposed feudalism and serfdom on the native Irish. The English, who conquered and ruled Ireland from the 16th to the 19th century, exploited the Irish through land confiscation, taxation, penal laws, and transportation. The Barbary pirates captured and sold thousands of Irish people as slaves in North Africa and the Ottoman Empire from the 16th to the 18th century. The American colonists imported and exploited Irish as indentured servants and slaves in the 17th and 18th centuries. Now, some of you are probably wondering where the name or term slave came from, so let's reveal that as well. The Slavs, or the Slavic peoples, were captured and enslaved by various peoples throughout history, such as the Vikings, the Normans, the Byzantines, the Mongols, the Ottomans, and the Tatars. The Slavic slave trade, especially the Slavic sex slave trade, was most active from the 8th to the 11th century, when the Vikings and the Khazars raided and sold many Slavs, especially their women, to the Islamic world via the Volga and Dnieper trade routes. The type of slavery that the Slavs endured varied depending on the culture and religion of their captors. A few Slavs were used as domestic servants, but most were sex slaves. Some of the young boys were turned into soldiers or craftsmen. Some of the boys, when they reach adulthood, were used in the deadly parts of the force to work, as agricultural laborers, miners, galley rowers, or gladiators. The word slave comes from medieval Latin sklavus, which means slave or a person of Slavic origin. This is because Slavs were often captured and enslaved by other peoples, like the Turks, throughout the Middle Ages. So have we all become slaves? With the exception of the ones enslaving us. What's that percentage enslaving us? Maybe about 1% of the world. We are no longer taught how to establish or run a business as we grow up in public schools. We are taught to get a job and to make that job our purpose in life. We are discouraged from building a business by ourselves or with others, or to pay to help liberate each other in this way. Some of you are saying, but look at the philanthropy the rich do through their charities. They have hospitals, give food and clothing around the world. Why, yes, they do. They want the slave base well and healthy, but not independent and free in a business for themselves. We'd make 7 to 10 times more with our own business or part of an employee-owned business than as being their worker-employee. Do the rich want any one of us to be free? We do not graduate, have our houses and business built for us, or live debt-free in a debt-free community. Instead, we pay taxes to bail out the rich if they fail, not to ensure we all have a business. We have to pay taxes on everything because we don't have businesses or employee-owned businesses. We pay the taxes, and we have a government that has indebted us with interest on loans for the rich. In fact, we are told to take out loans for everything, thus live our lives as wage slaves, coveting and wanting what we would not if we had our own businesses, and when we get old or wounded, we're suddenly useless breathers, socialists, a drain, no longer a wanted community member with no inheritance for our children. We all have the same dream, to be free. It won't happen until we follow the path God gave us when we were freed from Egypt. I mean, even if we are united as God's children again, and I see the same thing you all see, it will take God to free us and put us back on path again. I think it may happen quicker than we think. God hears our cries. Proverbs 22:7, the rich rules over the poor, and the borrower is the slave of the lender. Ezekiel 18:13. Lends at interest and takes profit. Shall he then live? He shall not live. He has done all these abominations. He shall surely die. His blood shall be upon himself. Exodus 22:21, you will not mistreat an alien, and you will not oppress him, because you were aliens in the land of Egypt. 22, you will not afflict any widow or orphan. 23, if you indeed afflict him, yes, if he cries out at all to me, I will certainly hear his cry of distress. 24, and I will become angry, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives will be widows and your children orphans. Well, on that cheery note, I pray we are all liberated soon. God bless.